This video is a continuation in a series of videos on Heroku architecture, Credential by example. So this is actually going to be another Salesforce integration video. The last one we just did was REST API, and this time we're going to focus on another product called Heroku Connect. It is, in particular, it's unique to the Roku platform. It's an add-on that's again, it only makes sense in the context of Heroku. The REST APIs you could have technically used another like Amazon or something else for that, but Heroku Connect only works on Heroku. Basically, well, let me Google it real quick. Heroku Connect and right. So Heroku Connect is basically a bidirectional synchronization between Salesforce objects and Postgres database, meaning tables and fields, right? So again, bidirectional means you can, one is take data that's from Salesforce, like we did with the REST example, pull it down to a local Postgres database. But more importantly, we can actually write to that same database and have that data post back into Salesforce. Now, under the hood, Roku Connect simply just uses the SOAP APIs to move data back and forth, right? And the pricing model is you don't pay these API requests don't count towards like your REST API requests, right? There was limits around that, but you do still pay in this case, based on the amount of data you're synchronizing. Basically, the rows you pay per row of connected data. So generally, if you think about this is great for a situation where you have less data, right? So you have less rows to synchronize, but maybe you need to use that data quite a bit from the outside, from a Heroku application. So you may have a lot of different people might need to access the data through your APIs, but it's not a ton of data. So that's like the ideal situation. So like a public website that was consuming with millions of transactions back to your Postgres database is the model that you're looking for here. The pricing is not transparent. You actually have to contact sales, and then you work with a salesperson to get pricing. So in fact, I don't actually know the pricing of it. So what we're going to do is, but the good news is that they offer a free version for developers to play around with. So we're going to use it that way. So let's do this. Let's go to Roku and see how to use this. So the first step we need to do is, before we go to our code, we have to set up Heroku Connect. And the first thing you need to observe is that there is no such thing as a local environment for this. This is all implemented through Heroku, right? So you can't, we can do local development, but we'll have to do something else a little bit, how to do that. So we'll do that in a minute. So the first step is we need to go into one of our apps and go into our staging app, right? And this is the status of it was last time. And I already have a Postgres instance here. So that's the first step. You need to have a Postgres, whatever app you're going to add to Roku Connect, you need to have a Postgres instance, okay? The next thing you need to do is go to add-ons. So let's go to resources and let's type in Heroku Connect. Okay, so here we are. And there's a demo version, and then there's basically enterprise contracts. So there's no other pricing. So we're going to use the demo version for this. It's fairly limited, but it's enough to get us going. Okay, so now I've got it provisioned. Pretty sure it doesn't add any environment variables, right? So if I go to my real config, there's no new Roku Connect environment variables. That's not how you interact with it, right? So what you do is, you go back to overview, you click on Heroku Connect, and you're going to get kicked off to an add-on login page, right? So the first thing you need to do before you can do anything with Heroku is that you have to basically log in. So we're going to log in. So the first, okay, so well, we're getting close to that. So previously, when we were creating our Postgres has a concept of schemas, which are basically namespaces. The objects that we created previously all lived in the public namespace because we didn't provide a namespace. So you typically don't want to have this Heroku Connect database, the synchronization kind of in the same namespace is where you're writing your tables. So by default, the namespace is Salesforce. It's changeable. So I'm going to leave it alone. So all my tables now that Heroku Connect will do will be Salesforce.table name. Okay. So we hit next. We already picked the database it's going to go into right there, right? And we are going to, you have to choose what level of APIs that you integrate with. I'm going to use the latest version since I'm going to use the latest version, which is summer 19. Okay, so then we hit authorize, and I have to log in to Salesforce, which I already logged in earlier, and boom, I'm done. Well, I'm not done, but I'm logged in, and you can see right now the status is idle because I've not actually mapped any objects to be synchronized, so there's nothing to do, right? So the next thing you do once you're here is you click on mappings, right? And so right now I'm not mapping any objects, so I'm going to go here and I'm going to say create mapping. Now I'm just going to pull my contacts over just like I did earlier. So this is basically, this long list is a list of all of the Salesforce objects pretty much this Salesforce org has, and of course there's lots of them, right? I mean, this is just the C's. And then if you had custom objects, you would have them all here too. So generally the things you can synchronize are sort of the Salesforce objects, the objects themselves. It doesn't synchronize metadata, right? So things like permissions and all that. Well, permission sets actually might be here, but like the actual permissions on the objects or something like that. This is just synchronizing essentially the data. Okay, so that's how you need to think about it. So I'm going to go to contact because that was the same thing we synchronized with REST, right? And there are some settings here. We're going to right. So this is the synchronization. Right. So this is the synchronization from Salesforce to the database. And the polling frequency, you can change the polling frequency, right? In this case, I'm going to set it for every 10 minutes. So this is basically just like we did in the hourly manual polling. Every 10 minutes, it's going to poll Salesforce if there's any changes. Okay. There's a flag here which we can't set right now. This is a setting or allows, and we're going to do another example a little bit later. Where we write to the database and such, and we'll look at this accelerated polling, right? But basically, what accelerated polling is that what happens then is the Roku Connect will basically maintain a connection to Salesforce, and when that object, anything in that kind of object updates, it would immediately trigger an update. So it's like almost like an immediate update. We'll do that later, and we'll talk later about. This is we're going to do a read-only connection right now, but there's a way to push data from the database back to Salesforce. There's some complexity though using external IDs, and that's another whole conversation. So we're not going to do that now. And then okay, so now I'm basically down to the stuff that makes more sense. On a contact, of course, the contact object has a ton of fields, right? So for now. By default, it sets a created date, which is probably not a bad idea to leave. And it has an ID, which is basically the Salesforce ID, an is deleted flag, and I believe a system modify date, right? So I'm going to leave those on. And then in addition, I want to pull up the name. So let's see, where's the name? I guess it's under N. Oh, no. Well, where's the contact? Field name, this is a contact, right? Oh, I did contract. Dang it. Okay, no wonder. I want to do contact, so let me go down to contact, not contract. There's contact. Okay. So this one does support accelerated polling, but we're not going to leave it. We're not going to turn it on. And leave it at 10 minutes. I'm going to leave all the defaults here like I did earlier, but I'm looking for name. Let's see, there's a first name. I think actually there's first name, last name. Actually, let's do There's actually name too. That's the full name. So we'll just leave it like the default. So it has the person's name and some of the metadata like the ID and last modified date. So I'm not going to actually change anything here. Okay, and then I say save. Okay, so you can see right now it's what it just did was it went into my Postgres database, created the necessary tables, right, and then it started pulling the data from Salesforce, and you can see right now it pulled over 16 fields because, you know, that's all that actually I had inside of my Salesforce org, and right now it has 16 rows in the database. Okay, and then every 10 minutes it's going to synchronize this. So if I delete something in Salesforce, it'll delete here. If I add something in Salesforce, it comes here. If I update something in Salesforce, it's going to come here. Again, this is not right now. This is not bidirectional. So generally, we're not going to want to delete things from our database locally. This is not a bidirectional. So we need to treat this as essentially as a read-only table. Okay, so that's the first thing. Let's look at a couple of the settings here, and then we'll switch to looking at the database next. So logs, this basically tells you any sort of logs, Salesforce errors. This is generally going to be when you're writing data back into Salesforce. If there's some reason why that write failed, you would see it here. Audit messages tells me who did what human did what in terms. So you can see that I actually went ahead and mapped in the contact object, right? Explore allows you to explore the data, right? So here's all the objects that it pulled down, and this is going to be more interesting when we do bidirectional work. You can actually look at the data as it's being pushed back into Salesforce, and you can kind of see sort of a transaction log here, right? External objects, we're not going to talk about on this one. Settings, these are various settings. We pretty much did this. You can, one important setting in particular, you can actually export this configuration. So let's say you have a ton of mappings defined. You can actually, and you're doing some Salesforce org transfer, and you need to have the same settings somewhere else. You can do an export here and then re-import in the new Salesforce org, and then not have to create all these mappings essentially yourself or recreate them. So that's basically it for this. So let's switch gears now and look at the database. Look at this from the perspective of a database. So if I go to settings, so let me connect to this database and see. Start this up. Did I start it? There it is. Okay, so the database is on my staging environment, right? So in fact, I don't think I need that around anymore. So I'm going to clean up. So I'm going to do PG, sly, paste in that, connect to my database. Okay, so the first thing, let's see. So if I describe tables, by the way, you'll see that I'm only seeing the stuff that lives in the public schema, right? I always forget how to do this. If you do Postgres set default schema, see if I can. There's a. This is. If you ever wonder, this is how I remember everything. How to change default schema. Okay, it's one of these articles. Like really? Oh, there it is. So there's a command in Postgres that says search path, and then new schema, right? And the Salesforce, it's going to only look for Salesforce for tables, and I think I can do. I don't know. Let's try it. Public. I don't know if this is going to work. It did work. Okay, so it looks like you can do this is what basically is when you do these commands now in Postgres, right? I don't have to specify, to like look for tables, I don't have to specify the schema. So you can see now, actually look in the trigger log, just like you can see on the GUI tool, and you can see what is actually being sent to Salesforce if you need to troubleshoot what data is being pushed into Salesforce. Right now it should be mostly empty. Let's see. I'm guessing if I do select star from Salesforce dot underscore trigger log, yeah, it's basically empty because I'm not writing any data to Salesforce, right? But if I do select star from Salesforce contact, you will see I've got my data. There's 16 records, right? That's because that's what we noticed. And there's our data, right? So it has, so in terms of IDs, right? There's the Salesforce ID, which is an ID that makes sense from a Salesforce perspective, and then ID is just an auto-incrementing integer that that is maintained by Heroku. I mean by Postgres itself. Now, I'm pretty sure. Let's describe. Let's see. Let's describe this table. So this is called contact. D contact. Okay, so let's look at the indices in particular, right? So the particularly the Salesforce. Let's see, the IDs are. Let's see, indices contact has a index as well as Salesforce ID, right? That's important. And so the reason why this is important is what's important. So the question is, what IDs do you typically want to use? So in all of my examples I've done, I've always used the Salesforce ID. In any context, I need to reference an ID in the context of Roku Connect. I don't even pay attention to the fact that there's an ID there at all. So you should be using Salesforce ID as your identifier. That just makes it consistent with Salesforce. If you're talking to people at Salesforce, those IDs are unique and they're sensible to people in Salesforce too. Okay, so that's it for just poking around the database, right? So I'm going to leave this up for a second here. So just, yeah. Now the next step we want to do, I'll quit this. Let's look at the code now. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is think about like running locally, right? So we'll do one more setup here. Okay, so here I am in my project, right? And the first thing, I'm going to go ahead and edit this real quick. So my environment variables are in my .env file. So where's my .env file? There it is. Okay, so right now my database is pointing to my local Postgres, but because now I want to use data that's in Roku Connect, I really can't use my local database unless I manually create all those tables myself. So I'm going to switch this to be, so I'm running locally, right? But in terms of the database, I'm going to actually start using the database that's in my staging environment as sort of my database. Okay. Okay. Either way, I don't have a better solution for now, so that's probably what we're going to do. I mean, you could do things like clone data down, but either way, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to just point my local environment to my staging database, and let's make sure everything at least starts here first. So if I do this, I do npm run watch ts. That starts up the compiler, and then if I go to run watch node. Okay, now so I have my compilers running, and then my node, which is running Heroku local, starting Heroku local, should be connecting to the database, and then I should see SSL off. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. Looks like we had some either a typo or something. I'm going to pause the video for a second, and let me troubleshoot this, and I'll come back to you. Okay, I'm back. Found out what the problem was. Turns out, and I went ahead and implemented some fixes here to address this, but it turns out that Heroku, the Postgres instance that's there, right, requires that you connect with SSL unless the client is on, like basically the dyno that's on the same app, right? So you can use HTTP without the S if the code is running inside of Heroku to connect to Postgres. But if you're coming from outside of Postgres, the connection needs to be SSL enabled. So the quick fix here was when I was trying to start, the TypeORM was trying to connect to the database, and it wasn't connecting. That's because it didn't have, there's an extra flag on here, literally called extra, where you basically enable SSL. Now, in this case, I didn't want to always enable SSL. SSL has some overhead. So the thinking here, at least my thinking is, I'm going to, when I'm doing this locally, right, then I'm going to use SSL to connect to the database, right? In this case, the Postgres database in Heroku. But when I'm running this code on inside of Heroku, I'm going to let it not use SSL and rely on its internal security to protect it. So that way I can get the performance of no SSL when I'm running inside of production. And then likewise, okay, so that took care of that bug. So so locally I'm setting an environment. Oh, one thing I also did in terms of fixing the code, I realized I didn't have some of the environment variables I was using defined in this environments file, so I went ahead and moved them here. And then I fixed the server to basically use the local host, the environment variable file. Now, separately, so here's the next thing. So when I want to connect to the tables that are managed by Salesforce, I don't want to use TypeORM, because TypeORM is about managed, entities that it manages, and not necessarily about it basically, TypeORM manages its own schema. That's the real value of it, right? Now, I'm sure you can make it work without that, but in this case, I really don't need the power of TypeORM to interact with the Salesforce managed schema. So I'm going to go back, looked up the old video of how I did Connect. So I used Connect, the library, right? And then you can see here, I do one extra thing. If it's localhost if localhost is not undefined, right? It means there's a value for localhost. I set the PG library to run as the SSL, okay? And then otherwise, regardless, I'm going to create a new client to connect, right, as before. Again, this change is only about just changing the using environment variable. So I think down here is the only thing I really added new. So here I say app get contacts, right? I go to PG client. I look for Salesforce ID and name from salesforce.contact, because this is the schema, right? And then I basically just send the contact. It's basically the contacts, and that's it. So to validate this is working, let me start up a browser. Let me get a browser window open, apparently, and my browser's on the screen. So if I got this working right, I should be able to go to HTTP localhost, HTTPS localhost 5000. Okay, so make sure that's running. Okay, and then I go to contacts. I don't know why it wants to translate this, but the browser, for some reason, thinks this is a different language. But you can see here that I've got my data, my Salesforce ID and names. So pretty straightforward. Okay, so the last step here is let's go ahead and push this up to Roku and make sure it's still working there. And so let me close this down. Let me kill this. Don't need that around. Let me kill this. Get status. Okay, so that's all I really did to make this work. So git add all, git commit -m. What is this? This is a Roku Connect HC. Okay. Then I go git push origin master. Then we go ahead and get another Heroku Connect window open, and let's see if this thing is actually working. So I go here, and I see it's not deploying yet. I can see continuous integration started, but it hasn't started the build yet. So let's give it a second. Be impatient. Okay, so it's building it. Okay, this may take 30 seconds or so, and then we'll just validate that we're able to start the app and make sure that we can get to the contact data. Okay, I'm going to be patient. Okay, I'm going to pause the video for a second. Of course, the moment I do, it's going to be done, but I'm going to pause it anyway. Okay, we're back. Okay, so let's see if this worked. So I got the app, open app in browser. Okay, at least it didn't crash. And then if I go to contacts, is it pulling it? And there's my data, right? And it's good. Okay, so now I've promoted this to my staging environment, and this time it shouldn't be using HTTPS to connect to the database, and it still works, right? And then the to-dos was the other. So that used Connect, and then to-dos actually used a separate connection, that was done with the type ORM. Okay, so it's all good. Okay, we'll stop with this section, and then we'll move to two-way data share binding, right? Where we can share data, bidirectional data flow, let's say, of Heroku Connect, and how to make that work. Okay, let me stop the video.